The night air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Jake had always loved his nightly walks with Max, his loyal golden retriever. It was their ritual. After a long day of work, they would stroll through the neighborhood, weaving through the dimly lit streets, the only sounds being the distant hum of cars and the rhythmic tapping of Max's paws against the pavement. But something felt different tonight. The street lights flickered as they passed, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and move with a life of their own. The moon hung low in the sky, shrouded by thick clouds, making the world feel smaller, as if swallowed by the darkness. Max's ears twitched, his nose flaring as he sniffed the air, his usual playful energy replaced with an unusual stiffness. Jake brushed it off. Just a colder night than usual. But when they reached the park at the end of the street, a spot where Max loved to chase after invisible creatures, he stopped dead in his tracks. The park was empty. Not unusual, given the late hour, but the silence was unnatural. Even the usual rustling of the trees had ceased. It was as if the entire world had taken a breath and was waiting for something to happen. Max growled. Jake tightened his grip on the leash. Easy, buddy. He scanned the area, seeing nothing but the dimly illuminated pathways and the faint outlines of the old swings swaying in the windless air. Then he saw it. At the far end of the park, just beyond the last functioning streetlight, stood a figure. Still, unmoving, almost blending into the darkness itself. Jake's breath hitched. The figure wasn't facing him, but something about its stance made his skin crawl. It was too rigid, too unnatural, and the longer he stared, the more he realized. It had no face. A wave of cold terror washed over him. He blinked, his eyes straining against the darkness, hoping that he was just seeing things. But the figure remained, standing impossibly still, just beyond the light's reach. Max's growl deepened, his body pressing against Jake's legs. Jake took a slow step back, heart hammering. He needed to leave. Now, as if sensing his fear, Max barked, a sharp, warning sound that echoed into the silence. The figure twitched, not a natural movement, but a grotesque, jerky motion, as if its body was learning how to move for the first time. Then it took a step forward. Jake turned on his heels and ran, Max's leash clutched tightly in his hands. The air felt heavier, thicker, pressing against his chest as he sprinted back toward his house. Behind him, he could hear something unnatural, something wrong, skittering across the pavement. Not footsteps, but a sound like bones scraping against stone, like something was dragging itself forward. He didn't dare look back. His house was in sight. The porch light was on, a beacon of safety. He reached the door, fumbled with his keys, hands trembling. Max barked again, turning toward the darkness behind them, teeth bared. The sound, the scraping, the dragging was closer. Finally, the key turned. Jake shoved the door open, yanked Max inside, and slammed it shut. He pressed his back against the wood, breathless, listening. Silence. Then a tap, a single, deliberate tap against the door. Jake's entire body went rigid. His breath came out in short, uneven gasps. He pressed his ear against the door, heart thudding so loudly he thought it might give him away. Another tap, and then the doorknob twisted. Jake stumbled backward, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp. His mind raced. He locked the door. He knew he locked the door. Max growled lowly, his body pressed against Jake's legs, muscles tensed, ready to fight. The knob twisted again, harder this time, like someone, or something, was testing it. Then it stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Jake didn't move, didn't breathe. And then he heard it. A whisper, a voice, right outside the door. So close that it sent a shiver down his spine. You should have never walked your dog after dark. A cold dread settled into Jake's bones. His grip on the lamp tightened. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence was gone. The weight of the air lifted. The night fell silent again. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat on the couch, lamp in one hand, Max curled up beside him, ears twitching at every creak and groan the house made. By morning, he convinced himself it had been a trick of the mind, A shadow cast by the flickering streetlights. A prank, maybe. He rationalized every detail, clinging to logic like a lifeline. But when he stepped outside, his blood ran cold. The ground outside his front door was covered in long, deep scratch marks, dragging across the concrete, leading away from his house, vanishing into the darkness of the trees. And in the middle of those marks, a single footprint. It wasn't human. Jake spent the entire day trying to convince himself that what had happened the night before was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the unease never left. The scratches on the pavement, the haunting whisper, it all felt too real. He tried calling the police. But what could he say? That a faceless figure had followed him home and left inhuman footprints outside his door. By sunset, dread had settled deep in his stomach. He double-checked every lock, closed every curtain. But it didn't help. When the night came, it carried a weight, pressing against his walls, like something unseen was watching. Max refused to go near the door. Jake sat on the couch, gripping his phone, ready to call someone, anyone, if he heard that whisper again. Then the lights flickered. Max's growl filled the room, low and threatening. Jake's pulse quickened. He turned toward the door, expecting the same tapping sound from last night. But this time, the noise didn't come from the door. It came from inside the house. Jake spun around, every hair on his body standing on end. The noise, scraping, deliberate, was coming from the hallway. The lights flickered again, dimming for a fraction of a second before steadying. Max's growl turned into a whimper as he backed away, tail tucked between his legs. Jake's fingers clenched around his phone. His mind raced. There's no way someone could have gotten inside. I locked everything. A shadow shifted at the edge of his vision. He turned sharply toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. Nothing, just the long, dark corridor stretching beyond the reach of the light. Then a whisper, the same voice as before. You should have never walked your dog after dark. Jake's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't outside this time. It was behind him. Jake's breath hitched. He turned slowly, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The dim glow of the streetlight outside cast elongated shadows across his living room, distorting the furniture into grotesque shapes. But there, just beyond the threshold of his bedroom door, stood something tall and motionless. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his imagination. The figure was inside his house. Max whined, his body trembling against Jake's legs. Jake's fingers twitched, his phone slipping slightly from his grip. He wanted to call someone, to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off pavement. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if observing him. The whisper came again, but this time, it was inside his head. You shouldn't have let me in. Jake took a step back. The air turned icy. His breath came out in visible puffs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs locked in place. The thing in the doorway stepped forward, its limbs moving with an unnatural fluidity, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The moment it took another step, the house plunged into darkness. Max yelped. The room filled with an unbearable silence. Then a breath, warm and wet, right against Jake's ear. Jake screamed, lurching forward, stumbling into the coffee table. The breath against his ear vanished, but the air around him remained thick, suffocating. Max barked wildly, his body tense, eyes locked onto the darkness swallowing the hallway. Then the whispers returned, low at first, almost inaudible, but they grew layer upon layer, voices overlapping, men, women, children, whispering the same phrase over and over again. You shouldn't have let me in. Jake scrambled to his feet, his fingers fumbling for his phone. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the room in a cold glow. He tapped at the emergency dial, but before he could press call, the phone went dead in his hands. The screen turned black. A slow creak echoed from the hallway. The thing was moving. Jake backed away, heart hammering. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and pointed it toward the dark hallway. The beam shook in his trembling grip, but it revealed the figure standing in the doorway, closer now, its faceless head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, in a jerking motion, it lifted an arm and pointed at Max. The dog yelped and collapsed onto the floor, whimpering, unable to move. Jake felt his chest tighten. He rushed to Max, shaking him, calling his name. But the dog's body was stiff, his eyes wide with terror. A shadow fell over them, stretching across the floor. Jake forced himself to look up. The figure was right above him. He barely had time to react before it lunged. A deafening, inhuman screech filled the house. Jake threw himself backward, his hands scrambling for anything to defend himself. His fingers closed around the lamp from earlier, and he swung it blindly. The light shattered against the figure's body, and in an instant, everything went dark. Jake gasped for air, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He blinked, adjusting to the new darkness. The whispers were gone. The air felt lighter. He turned to Max, who blinked and sat up, shaking his head. Jake's heart swelled with relief, and he pulled the dog into his arms. Then he heard it, a soft tap at the door. A whisper slithered through the keyhole. "We will meet again." Jake bolted upright, grabbed Max, and without hesitation, fled through the back door, not daring to look back. He ran into the night, the chilling whispers following him into the wind. He never walked Max after dark again.